39B.
Okay, we're recording, Rab.
Sorry?
We're recording.
Yeah, we're learning as well. We've got it. Lamed Tet Amud Beis towards the bottom. Bacher Dav Davaniot. We'll just Bacher Dav Davaniot. We'll just go back. We'll just go back. Yeah. We started the Mishnah. We passed the Mishnah. Okay. But I'll give her what you call it.
It was very Bacher with
Okay. Okay, but that's okay, Will.
It was very quiet without you.
I tried to Zoom with you, but we didn't have Wi-Fi.
Oh,
Where were you in the Kruger?
Stephen, you have a page over there. You're good to go. 39B5, I think it is. I checked in. I'll check this one.
There we go.
39B5. How's it, Brian?
So we ran out of chairs.
Are we ready?
I guess the shot.
I think I'm competing with the cake and all the goodies.
Yeah.
All the country there. So tonight I want to have in mind, we learn for our friend's son, what's his name? Chaim Saki, Rafal Chaim Sholem ben Rivka Chava. Yeah. There was some positive flashes of positivity. So please God. He's a young father that took ill a week and a half ago. And we're hoping through the merits of our Torah learning to bring about refuah shleima, refuah krova, speedy and complete recovery. Please God, in the same place that we're davening for recovery, we'll be able to raise our glasses and thank Hashem for his miracles, for him, for anyone who needs refuah, health, and
Also for, sorry, El Roi Ben Bacher.
Roy Ben Bacher.
Roi Ben Bacher.
Ben Roy. El Roy.
He's the one that got hit by the terrorists.
Oh, really? El Roy, okay. El Roy Ben Bacher.
Two miracles happened. Rabbi Goldberg's better.
Yeah.
Still sponsored the book. He was in RCU for 3 months.
I remember you said so.
And this girl that was in RCU since February is now gone into a private ward. She's going to step down and she'll be a lot better.
Which one is that?
Her name is Kaya.
Thank you.
Beryl Sher's wife.
Ah, I know that
Beryl
family.
Sher.
I know. I did her bat mitzvah. She was once in my neighborhood. That young lady, when she was 12 years old, was in my neighborhood. Back then they lived in. I did her. Yeah, that's good to hear. So you say she's doing better.
Kaya
Yael, but Sharon.
Sharon.
Yeah.
Sharon,
Yeah. No, she's been through the wars. Oh, you know the family. You know Farrell. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
When I came to my shul about 25 odd years ago, 28 years ago, she was one of the first bat mitzvahs that I did in the shul there. So she was then 12. So we talked in Blackgowrie. Her family lived in Blackgowrie 28 odd years ago. So she would be around 38, 40, yeah. Because we came to that community 28 years ago, and she was one of the first bat mitzvahs that we did. Probably 95, 96, 97, somewhere in those years. And her father told me that she wasn't well, but she's yeah.
She went for
a minor procedural op. Yeah.
She ended up in RCU.
Yeah. Medical error there. Huge medical error. Yeah. Okay. So can we go for it? Does everybody?
Everyone's brought that.
10th time lucky. Tanya? Tanya Bacher Daya. Tanya Marga.
Gidon.
Le'ilu Nishmat Gidon Ben Malka. Le'ilu Nishmat Gidon Ben Malka. So we have the Neshamas in mind.
Shimon sends apologies.
Oh, really?
He's in Hammersville.
Oh, well, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
He sent me a special message.
Okay, so that's great. That's great. It's good to know. And yeah, okay. Yeah, no, of course, Shlema to Ashley. Ashley, you were struggling with something. Okay, and a special welcome to Maxi Bennon from my part of the world.
Give him a smile.
So we'll just backtrack a few lines where we spoke about the Duv Devaniot, which is the normally in Hebrew that means cherries. It's interesting that sometimes words that have a meaning in modern Hebrew in the Mishnah or the Gemora can have different meanings, or they can have a few meanings. So according to the commentaries, most of them are of the view that in the case of the Mishnah, we're talking about grapes. Although Duv Devaniot normally means cherries, in this case, according to most opinions, it's grapes. It could be other fruit. We're talking about clusters of grapes. And those that were here last week who braved the freeze was rather frozen.
The grapes. The
grapes weren't too frozen. The Jews were frozen. They were called the frozen chosen.
Yeah.
So
Frozen cluster.
yeah. So we spoke about the fact that these were grapes that were overripe, and therefore the Mishnah that we learned said that liquid was oozing from the grapes, and because liquid is oozing from the grapes, and because they're wet, they are susceptible to spiritual impurity. That's what we were speaking about last week. That what happens is that when a fruit or a vegetable is wet, that's when it conducts what's called tumah, the opposite of spiritual cleanliness, spiritual impurity. And then I did say the example, but because we're a much bigger group and it's an interesting example, on Pesach night at the Seder, when we dip our karpas, we dip the vegetable in the salt water, we normally go and wash as if we're having bread or matzah. We wash and then we dip the vegetable in the salt water. And the reason why we wash is because if a person is going to eat something wet, fruit or vegetables in a wet state, and we're talking about without a knife and fork, if you're going to actually, it's something we're not that familiar with, because people usually eat in today's day and age with utensils. And when you eat with utensils, it doesn't apply. But if you're eating with your hands and the food happens to be wet, then you are supposed to wash your hands beforehand, because then the wet food is susceptible to spiritual uncleanness, to tumah. But in the Mishnah, one of the things that the Mishnah had taught is that if the grapes are oozing or exuding their own liquid, in other words, it's not a foreign liquid, nobody washed it, nobody put it, if they're oozing their own liquid, then because it's own liquid, then it's not an issue. It's not like a separate thing. And then what happened was, just as we were finishing last week, the Gemora raised an objection, and it said that there was a discussion between the sages Hillel and Shammai. We'll read it inside in a moment. And Hillel and Shammai seem to say the opposite, that the wetness that's on the outside of the grapes does make them susceptible to spiritual impurity. So the Gemara wanted to know why there's a difference between what it says in, by the way, I can comfort you. We're moving into a part that's a lot less technical in the next 2-3 minutes. So if you find this a little technical, hold on tight, because we are moving in the next few lines into something that's a bit easier to understand. So it said over there, Vahadav Devaniot, which over here is translated as grape clusters, Achopisham and Natvois, even though they drip or ooze the liquid that's inside them, Ein Bohen Mishum Hershemashka, they don't have the problem, the risk of being susceptible to uncleanliness because of the fact that they're wet. That's what the Mishnah said. The Gemora then contrasted it and said, but we have a brighter, another passage which seems to say the opposite. That's very, very common pattern in Talmudic study, where you raise one thing against another and you want to know why it doesn't add up. Why does what it says in this place seem to contradict what it says in that place? Or a mini, we raised a contradiction where it said, Haboitzer lagas, if somebody goes and harvests grapes to take them to the wine press, in other words, he wants to crush them, he wants to make them into wine. Over there, it was quoted that there was a machloket, that means a difference of opinion between two sages. Shammai Omer, Shammai taught, Huchsha, that yep, because they're wet, you have to worry that if somebody whose hands are unclean touches them, spiritually clean, we mean, didn't wash negelvasa, it's a problem, they're wet. Hillel Omer loy Huchshar. Initially, Hillel debated with Shammai and said not susceptible, but then afterwards he changed his mind and he concurred with Shammai. And Hillel agreed with Shammai. And so we want to know, why is there this contradiction between the two sources? Sorry? All the time they were arguing, absolutely. They were general sparring partners. Yeah.
Israelis.
Yeah. So the Gemara taught us over here a fascinating idea. The idea is that it's all about intent. Your intention is what gives the power to the liquid on these grapes to either cause spiritual impurity or not. What does that mean? That if a person's intention in harvesting the grapes is to turn them into grape juice or wine, then they become considered liquid already. They're a beverage, because the whole reason you're picking them is to turn them into wine, to turn them into grape juice. So immediately they're called a beverage. And then that's when they get graded with the laws of beverage or water. In other words, quite interesting. Imagine saying that if your intention is to make grape juice or wine, then your grapes are wet. But if your intention is to put the grapes in a fruit bowl and serve it for a snack, dry and whole or whatever, then they're not considered wet. So very interesting that this is a halacha, this is a ruling that is completely based on the person's mind, on the kavanah, on the intention of the person. So one person's picking grapes with the intention of putting them in a fruit arrangement and eating them solid. Another person's picking grapes with the intention of turning it into grape juice or wine. When the intention is to turn it into liquid, into beverage, then the wetness that comes from the grape on the outside is already considered to be liquid, and it is susceptible to spiritual impurities. But if your intention is not liquid, then it's not your problem that there is liquid. And this is an example.
Karpas is
Yeah.
vegetable. It's not.
Sorry?
Karpas is vegetable.
That's right.
That hasn't got a chance to be a wine.
No, but that's not an issue, because the problem with the karpas is you going to dip it in salt water, and that's got nothing to do with the water inside the vegetable. The salt, you're going to dip it in salt water, and you're going to touch it with your fingers. You're not going to eat it with a fork. You're going to touch it with your fingers. If your hands needed to be washed, then that's a problem, because the spiritual impurity, the tumah on the hands, is going to conduct to the wet karpas, to the wet vegetable. So in other words, if you look at it a little bit like, let's use electric as an example, certain things conduct energy, certain things don't. Glass, I think, or rubber or plastic doesn't conduct, metal does. So if we borrow that kind of example, spiritual impurity is conducted by moisture. If there's no moisture, then that spiritual impurity doesn't conduct. And in the place in Tumah Batara, in spiritual impurities, where it's discussed, over there, the halacha gives 7 different kinds of mashka, meaning certain liquids that can cause something to be...
Seven.
I think it's 7, yeah, 7 types of liquids. Water, I think fruit juice is one of them, blood, wine, honey. I think there's a list of 7 different... I think there's a list of 7 different types of liquid that if something solid gets wet with that liquid, then it's a bigger problem if somebody's hands touch it and they're susceptible to uncleanliness. We're going to move on to these words, v'taris she'eina trufa. If you recall, the Mishnah had spoken before, and this is going to be a little bit less technical. So the Mishnah had spoken before about a certain kind of fish, which is called tarit fish, tarit. Sounds a bit like trout, but actually, in this case, I think he's actually talking about some kind of very small fish that's either an anchovy or a sardine. The commentaries on the Talmud are not 100% sure exactly which species of fish it's talking about. Bear in mind that fish are different all over the world. There's even a Rashi that says that a fish that comes up in the port in Akko is not like a fish that comes up in another place. Fish can be very different. But what we had said in a previous Mishnah was that, and just for a little bit of background to the people that have joined us recently, we're talking about the fact that once upon a time, most of foods were procured from home industry. People made things in their homes. And people bought not only from Jews, they bought from Gentiles too. In other words, it could be that one fellow pressed olives and made olive oil. That's how he made his living. And if you went a few houses down, there was the guy that did the honey and the guy that did the bread. And everything was basically, you could call it pretty much home industry. Everybody had, call it a mini factory in his yard or whatever it was. Now, one of the main subjects of this whole parak, which by the way we're about to finish, we're actually about to make, probably it will be next week's shiur, a siyum on the second chapter of Avodah Zarah, of this tractate. But most of the subject matter of this second chapter has been about what foods you're allowed to buy from goyim and what foods you can't buy from goyim. In other words, on what can Gentiles be trusted and on what can they not be trusted. And we went through various types of food. And one of the things we were told in the previous Mishnah is that minced fish, talk about, for a modern example, fish paste. I don't know why it recently got yanked off the shelves. I don't know what happened over there.
You said that.
Pex, did I say that?
Yeah. There were so many fish that were caught at once, they weren't sure which were kosher, which weren't.
So this is the discussion of the coming Gemora. Yeah. So if you've got a fish paste, you've got fish that's minced. You don't know what's in that mince, what kind of fish has been minced. So we said that the rabbi said you can't buy minced fish from Gentiles because of the fact that you can't tell what kind of fish it is. Maybe they minced eel, maybe they minced seafood. How do you know that this is a kosher fish, that this is, I don't know what, a hake or a salmon or a tuna or whatever that they've minced? Now, one of the fish that was mentioned was tarit, and the previous Mishnah had said v'tarit trufa, which means minced tarit fish is no good. And tarit was just an example. Could be any fish. Is no good because you don't know what fish is in the ingredients. However, this Mishnah said v'tarit she'eina trufa, if it's not minced, maybe you get a fish pate where the fellow that's made it has left pieces inside there. This is what this Gemora deals with. And from the pieces, you can actually see what kind of fish he's using. So because it's not minced, and you can identify the fish from the chunks, let's call it chunks or pieces, according to this Mishnah, as that texture is kosher, you can use it. But tarit she'eina trufa, tarit fish that's not fully minced. And I'm saying not fully minced because you'll see how the Gemora describes it. Tanu Rabbanon, the rabbis learned in a passage explaining this. What's considered not minced? What would be considered not minced? So it says, if you can see the head and the spine of the fish. When you look at the fish, if the little heads, that we're saying little because it's usually small fish, if you can see the little heads, like let's say somebody made a snook pate or a pilchard pate or whatever it is, and you happen to notice little pieces of heads and little pieces of spines of these pilchard fish, and you can tell clearly what kind of fish it is from the spine and the head, then it's okay. Then it doesn't matter. Then it's if you can see the reish and the shidra, which means the head and the spine of the fish, and what kind of brine is considered a brine that has a fish. The other thing apparently it was very common in those days. They sold brine, which was like a liquid, almost like a vinegar or some kind of condiment, how would you call it, or sauce that was made by boiling or soaking or pickling fish in the brine. And we had said that if you don't know where the brine comes from, you can't use it because it might have been made by the Gentile with stray fish, with fish that's not kosher. But if you know what fish they use to make the brine, then it's okay. And what does it mean, a brine that you know? So what the Gemora explained based on the Mishnah was that the custom was that in many cases, the manufacturer or the home industry person would leave a piece of fish floating in the brine. And that's how you'd know what kind of brine it was, because there was a piece of fish floating inside it. And you could tell from the fish that was floating inside it what kind of fish. So this Mishnah had said, Sir sheyesh podaga, that if you've got a kilbit, which is a type of fish floating in the brine, you're allowed to assume that that's what he made the brine from. What does it mean, a brine that has fish in it? If you can see floating in that brine, in the jug or the barrel, 1 kilbit or 2 kilbiot, that's good enough. Then you're allowed to assume that the whole barrel is made from kosher fish. They're floating in it. The Gemora asked, what is this business of 1 kilbit or 2 kilbit achas amris shara? You've already said that if there's one of these fish called kilbit, which are kosher, floating in the brine, it's good enough. Shtei kilbit mabayi. Why do you need to mention 2? In other words, normally halacha is very specific. It doesn't use like estimates. If 1 or 2 are there, it's okay. What's this 1 or 2? If 1 is okay, then what's the issue of 2? So the Gemara explains, it's not a contradiction. In one case, we're talking about open barrels. In another case, we're talking about sealed barrels. So you have 2 ways of packing fish brine. Sometimes you're going to have the fish brine in a container and it's sealed. And sometimes the fish brine that the non-Jew sells is in a container that's open. When it is in an open barrel, then you need 2 of these kilbiot fish to be inside it. Why? Because there's a bigger risk. If the barrel is open, you start to worry. He's making brine. Maybe he ran out of enough concentrate, so he went and took another fish and put it in. So we're more worried about the open barrel than the closed barrel. That's the bottom line. So if it's an open barrel, 2 kilbiots is a proof that the entire barrel was made with kosher fish. If it's a closed barrel, 1 is enough. Yeah, 1 of these fish called kilbiots. So in other words, you go to the Gentile and he's a fishman and he's selling fish brine, and you buy fish brine from him and you take the container or the barrel and you open it up, and he's got floating in there this fish called a kilbit, this kosher fish. If you see 1 of them in a sealed barrel or 2 of them in an open barrel, that tells you that he has used those fish to make it. And that's very interesting. We've said the way halacha works. It doesn't matter if he didn't use kosher fish. The halacha is that if you see 1 or 2, you're entitled to assume. If you don't see, then you can't assume that that brine is kosher. Then you have to worry. And
How can you identify the spine or the head?
yeah, it can be quite tricky. Yeah. Yeah, the spine of the fish. I guess if you take certain kinds of fish, that backbone is quite visible if it's there in the mush, like sometimes. In fact, what you notice actually is when people make a fish pate, they often will take out certain parts because what's the word? It's not pleasant if they're in there. Like when people mash pilchards, if those innards are inside the mix, they don't mix in nicely. It doesn't taste good. Yeah. So you'll see, or sometimes people buy sardines or pilchards and there's eggs and I don't know what you call it, the derms, or I don't know what they call it, the inside of the tummy. A lot of people will take it out of the can first before they mash it because it's not so pleasant in the mixture. So you can sometimes in a mixture still see certain things. And when you see those certain things, what this Gemora was saying is that if you can recognize the head and the spine, then you can recognize that it's a kosher fish, let's say a sardine or a herring or a kosher fish, and you're allowed to buy it or use it. Now, the Gemora starts to unpack this, and this actually we didn't read before. It was taught. Rav Huna taught, you need to see both the head and the spine of the relevant fish. Two parts have to be seen, both the head and the spine. Rav Nachman taught, one or the other. In other words, what the Gemara wants to know, is it an either or do you have to see both? According to Rav Huna, you have to see both, the head and the spine. According to Rav Nachman, one or the other. The Gemara then asks a question. Mosiv Rav Ukva Bar Chama. Rav Ukva Bar Chama asked the question, what are we talking about, spines and heads? How do you know if a fish is kosher? Anybody want to try? Fins and scales. Normally, we've always been told that a fish is kosher based on fins and scales. So the one question you want to know is, why is there suddenly a discussion about spines and heads? What's spines and heads got to do with whether or not the fish is kosher? Surely, we judge whether a fish is kosher based on fins and scales. So the commentaries on the Gemara come up with various different theories. One theory is that if you can see the head and the spine, that's how you're going to know about fins and scales, that the two come together, that you'll see scales on the head or on the spine. Other parts of the fish might not be evident that there's fins and scales. The other possibility is that although spines and heads are not the sign of a kosher fish, fins and scales are, but a spine and a head might allow you to identify the species. Once you can identify the species, you can ask your marine biologist if this type of species is kosher. Even if you can't see the fins and scales, if you can be sure that this is, for instance, a sardine, it's not some other sea creature, then once you've confirmed that it's a sardine, you've also confirmed that it is a kosher fish, which if you did see the whole body, you would see fins and scales. So basically there is this discussion. The Meforshim, that means the commentators on this Gemara, seem to worry a little bit about why there's so much talk about spines and heads as opposed to fins and scales. And generally, that is the point that they make, that the spines and heads is just to identify the species. Because if you have that much that's identifiable, you're going to know what species it is. But Mosiv Rav Ukva Bar Chama asks a question over dogim. When it comes to fish, it says, Kol sheyesh lo snapir v'kaskeses, that anyone that has fins and scales. So why are we saying over here that as long as you can see the head and the spine, you're okay? What happens if you see the head and the spine, but you can't see the fins and the scales? Amar Abaya said, Kitanya, hi, when did we learn this Mishnah? But Ara ufalmuda, in particular place called Ara and Palmuda fish, so a particular fish called Ara and Palmuda, the Damu Reishayu L'Tmayim, that have similar heads and backs, spines to non-kosher fish. In other words, what Abaya explains is that there are certain species of fish that the head and the spine looks exactly the same as another species that's not kosher. Sometimes you have very similar things. And therefore, in another place, it was stated, you must see fins and scales. With regard to those species of fish that have similar looking features to non-kosher fish, the head and the spine is not going to help you. Which ones? He mentions two species here, a fish called Ara, a fish called Palmuda. Those are fish that look very similar to non-kosher fish. And the head and the spine is not going to help you. So that's where another Mishnah said you have to see fins and scales. But in general, if you're going to identify the head and the spine, you will know what kind of fish it is. And once you know what kind of fish it is, you'll know if it's kosher or not, whether you see the fins and scales or not.
So even tuna itself.
But it could be, sorry, scales is enough, exactly, because then there's fins. But not necessarily do the trade tuners and the kosher tuners have the same kind of head. What he's talking about here is a particular type of fish that the heads look identical, even though one is kosher and one is fish. I'm not sure with regard to the differences between kosher and non-kosher tuna. But it would come out from this Gemora that in any case where one can positively identify the species based on the head and the spine, those two features, and then based on the head and the spine, you're going to know exactly what it is. Let's say the mumcha, the expert's going to tell you, buddy, that's a trout, that's a snook, that's a carp. Then that's good enough. In other words, even if because it has been pickled or minced or out the water, you can't see fins and scales, but if you are absolutely sure that it's identifiable as a particular species, which is a kosher species, then it's okay. And I don't know if you remember some years ago, I think I was a child then. So the reborn missionaries, they had this kind of a fish symbol, and they were putting them on all the cars, on the bumper stickers. In those days, bumper stickers were quite big. And they were putting the symbol of a fish. It looked like that, like a crossover fish. And it was basically, I'm a reborn. It was like a pride thing, I'm a reborn. So I remember somebody printed like a gefilte fish with a carrot, and he said, this is a gefilte fish. I'm a reborn Jew. It was like an answer. Sorry? Sorry? I don't know why, but
That was good. I'm a reborn.
You like that?
Brilliant. Filter fish.
Omar Rav Yehuda, Mishmei Ola. Up to, we got more time. Omar Rav Yehuda, Mishmei Ola. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Ola, Machloikas, Machloikas letabel b'tziron. The difference of opinion between Rav Huna and Rav Nachman is with regard to dipping foods in fish brine. Aval begufon, but with regard to eating the flesh of the fish, devrei hakol asur, everybody agrees that it is prohibited, until you can identify the head and the spine. In other words, what Rav Yehuda is saying over here is that the chiddush, call it the novel idea here, is that although we're worried about fish and fish brine, the isur, the prohibition on non-kosher fish brine, for whatever reason, is at a lower tier than the fish itself. Therefore, according to Rav Yehuda, the argument between Rav Nachman and Rav Huna, if you need the spine and the head to be identifiable, was with regard to brine. When it came to fish brine, Rav Nachman said, you know what, it's good enough if you see the spine or you see the head. If you can't see both, nit geferlach, as long as you can identify the fish based on the head, or, in other words, either or, you can dip your food in the brine. It seems that's what they used the brine for. It was a dip. It was for dipping purposes. You can dip your bread in that kind of brine. However, that's with regard to the brine. But with regard to the flesh, the meat of the fish itself, nobody argues. Both Rav Huna and Rav Nachman will agree. No one disagrees. They agree that you need to identify the kashrut of the fish based on the spine and the head. In other words, that argument that he said, either or, was only with regard to brine. But with regard to the body, the flesh itself, divrei hakol asur, they all agree prohibited, until you can identify the head and the spine. And on that, the Gemora brings an anecdotal example. Often you'll get like an anecdotal example where somebody will say a story. By me, this is exactly what I did. Like when you talk about something and somebody says, I remember in my Boba's kitchen, I remember my grandfather or by my grandmother. So Omar Rabbi Zaira said, in the beginning, in other words, initially, I used to dip things in the brine of fish, even if only the spine or the head were recognizable as a kosher fish. In other words, I accepted this concept that when it comes to brine and you're just dipping stuff in fish brine, either the spine or the head of the fish is enough to identify it as a kosher fish. I didn't worry if there was both. But when I heard this lesson, when somebody told me this, that Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Ula, Machloikas letabel b'tziron, that the argument is about dipping in the brine, avol begufon divrei hakol asur, but when it comes to the flesh of the fish itself, everybody agrees that you need both the spine and the head to identify it as a kosher fish, otherwise prohibited. Until you could identify both head and spine. Then, I decided I'm not dipping in brine either. In other words, what Rabbi Zair is saying is, I'm telling you a story about myself. Initially, I went easier on brine than on fish. I believed that it's good enough if I got fish brine and I could tell that the type of fish they made the brine from, that either by a piece of head that was floating around or a piece of spine that was floating around, that the brine was made from kosher fish. That was good enough, either or. But then when I heard afterwards that everybody agrees that the meat of the fish, the actual meat, you shouldn't touch it unless you can identify it by both the spine and the head, I decided I'm not even using the brine. In other words, I went one step further. I went one step stricter, and I decided that I'm not even going to use the brine. Let's catch one more group of lines. Omar Rav Papa, based on this, Rav Papa taught, Rav Papa said that if you've got a barrel of call it a fish stew, and a whole bunch of chunks or pieces floating in it, you need to be able to identify every chunk as a kosher chunk. So in other words, when we talk about noticing a head and a spine and identifying it as kosher, so this is quite a strict take. Every chunk in the barrel has to be identifiable. So the Gemora asked, hold on, Rav Papa, that's a very strict take. You're saying every single chunk that's floating in the barrel has to be identified, but didn't we say above that one is enough? Meisvei, they asked a question, if you have pieces that have a simon, that have a sign of kashrut, a sign that they're kosher, either identifiable that it's a certain kosher species, or fins and scales. We learnt whether all the chunks or whether just some of them, good enough. In that particular passage, it said even 1 out of 100. If you've got even 100 chunks of fish floating in a barrel that a guy's produced pickled fish or whatever it is, and 1 out of 100 you can tell for sure is from a kosher fish, it's good enough. Even 1 out of 100, the entire barrel's kosher. So much so that there was a story like this. There's a story that a particular guy, a particular Gentile, was involved in producing, fish stew. He brought a big barrel of pieces of fish in a brine, fish stew in a brine, pickled fish. And they found a sign of kashrut in one piece in this huge big barrel. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who was a great sage, permitted the entire barrel based on the one piece that they were able to identify. So why did Rav Papa say you've got to identify each piece? Who's right over here? So the Gemora said, yeah, Tir Gemora Rav Papa. Rav Papa said, when you've got a whole bunch of pieces, and it looks like the pieces come from the same fish, they all look the same, or they look like a puzzle. You know, somebody cut a fish up and it looks a bit like a puzzle. When there's a relationship between the different pieces, then you can, what's the word, exempt everything based on one. But if they're completely different, this guy had a fish shop, and at the end of the day he's chucking everything from all over the place. It could be a crab in the one corner and I don't know what, and a hake in the other and whatever. He's just putting in the stew whatever happened to be there. That's no good. Yeah, sorry. One piece of kosher fish, that doesn't work. So Rav Popo explains it that when we say that one piece exempts every other piece, they must look the same. You must be able to see that, that's a hake. These all look like hake too. But not if they all look different. One's dark, one's light, one's got this texture, one's got that texture, one's got a few feet on it, whatever. You can't stretch this all the way. So the Gemora says, so the Gemora says, what do you have to teach this at all? Obviously, if the pizzas match each other, then they're all kosher. If they match each other, they're all the same fish. So it says, I would have thought that we have to worry that maybe they all look the same, but they're not really the same. Kamash Milan, we learn otherwise, that if they look the same and they appear to all come from one type, if you take this whole big pickled fish jug and it looks to you like they're all the same color, the same texture, then the fact that bottom line is the fact that you can identify one piece and say that's kosher, that does exempt the rest of the barrel. So that's where we'll stop for today. But just maybe a little bit of summary would be, we're talking about fish that's bought from a Gentile, either minced fish or brine. And we're saying that if you can identify properly from the chunks that are floating around in the barrel, that this either was a brine that was made with kosher fish, or a mince or a pate that was made from kosher fish, you are entitled to exempt the entire jug or the entire barrel. You're entitled to say that because I can see the spine and the head of what is identifiable as a kosher fish, I don't have to worry that the Gentile puts other things in there as well. I can assume that all of it was made from this type of fish, which is kosher, whether it's brine, whether it's fish stew, whether it's pickled fish, whatever it is. But if you can't tell, if you have no idea, there's no siman, it's called siman, there's no sign, then you can't touch it, you can't use it. Okay, so that's where we'll stop for today. Stick to grapes. Grapes have their challenges too.
What the fish?
My grandparents had a concession store in the middle of the feast. We're talking about all those barrels.
Yeah.
Each one had the own secret.
Yeah.
No,
They did a lot of pickling also, because in those days they didn't have fridges. I mean, even our grandparents didn't have access to fridges. My father always tells me about it. So they put stuff in jars. A lot of stuff was put in jars and because they and preserved and pickled, because they didn't have refrigerators and freezers to rely on like we do.
You got the fish, they say kosher, not mother. What the name? I forgot, like a snake.
It's King Club you're talking
King
about. Yeah, the King Club. Yeah. King Club was a big machloket in this country.
No, because they used to.
It was because there were
Because
some
there were
people that
22
didn't want to
kinds
accept
of
that it was kosher. 22 kinds. Yeah.
Some of them got
Yeah.
scared. Some of them.
Yeah.
And they look the same.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Rav. I'm gonna switch off. Thanks.